The mob once sent one of its most feared men uptown to deal with Bumpy Johnson. That much Harlem never forgot. What happened next depends on who's telling it. By the winter of 1943, Albert Anastasia already had a name that made grown men nervous. He ran the enforcement arm of the commission, the group the newspapers later nicknamed Murder Incorporated. He treated conflict the way a plumber treats a clogged pipe. It was a job. You showed up, you handled it, and you went home. Frank Costello is said to have picked him for the Harlem situation for exactly that reason. Costello needed someone who wouldn't hesitate, someone who wouldn't care that Bumpy Johnson was black, or that Harlem was a tight community, or that going after a popular man there carried risks the other families were nervous about. Anastasia didn't think that way. To him, Johnson was a problem, nothing more. Before we go further, one thing is worth saying plainly. Much of this story comes from Harlem's own oral history, passed down for decades, rather than from court records or newspaper archives. Not every story gets written down. Some survive because people refuse to stop telling them. Keep that in mind as we go, and we'll come back to it when it matters. The United States had been at war for about a year by this point. Federal investigators, already busy overseas, had also begun paying closer attention to city corruption, since anything related to war production was treated as a national concern. A loud, public fight in Harlem was exactly the kind of story that could draw eyes nobody downtown wanted drawn. Harlem's oldest stories say the commission gave Johnson 30 days to accept a partnership, splitting profits with the families in exchange for protection. When that deadline passed with no answer, and after Johnson supposedly sent 3 Italian policy bankers back into Little Italy, roughed up and carrying a warning note, the commission decided talking was over. Anastasia took the assignment. He didn't rush anything. For nearly 2 weeks, his men simply watched Harlem, learning who came and went, looking for one mistake to exploit. Think about what he was actually looking at, though. Most names that crossed Anastasia's desk belonged to street operators, men who'd stepped on the wrong toes or fallen behind on payments. Johnson wasn't that. He'd run policy operations in Harlem for over a decade. He'd done real prison time. He'd survived betrayals. He ran his organization less like a street gang and more like a small government. Here's what we do know for certain. Johnson was born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in Charleston, South Carolina, and came north during the Great Migration, as so many black families did in those years. The nickname came from a bump on his forehead, not from anything in his criminal life. He married a woman named May, whose own memoir, decades later, remains one of the more reliable windows into who he actually was outside the legend. Harlem itself carried its own history of resistance by the time Anastasia arrived. Years before Johnson rose to prominence, the numbers business there had largely been run by black operators who'd built it from nothing. Stephanie St. Clair was the most successful of them. She ran her own operation through the 20s and into the 30s, with a discipline that earned her respect, even from people who feared her. When Dutch Schultz tried to force his way into Harlem, she fought him with everything she had. She lost ground eventually. The fight itself became part of what Harlem told itself about who belonged there. People close to that era later remembered St. Clair as someone who refused to be quiet. She was born on the island of Martinique and came to New York in her 20s. She placed newspaper advertisements naming corrupt police officers. That reputation is on record, independent of anything involving Johnson or Anastasia. Legitimate banking, meanwhile, was mostly closed to black Harlem in these years, whether through outright discrimination or through barriers that made saving and borrowing far harder than it was a few blocks downtown. The numbers game functioned for many people as an informal financial system. That doesn't erase the harm gambling caused, but it explains why men like Johnson held a different kind of standing in the neighborhood than an ordinary criminal would have. Anastasia's scouts eventually zeroed in on a man named Junie Bird, Johnson's most trusted lieutenant, who ran the daily business of the policy banks. One version of the story says Bird kept a predictable Friday night habit, a card game at a club on 132nd Street, same table, nearly every week. To Anastasia, that looked like an opening. Now here's where the story shifts from something close to documented history into something closer to legend. What follows about the club comes almost entirely from accounts passed down through people connected to that world. No arrest report survives it. Different versions disagree on details even while agreeing on the outcome. Johnson already knew a crew was coming, or so the story goes. His information network, built from relationships with police, hotel and club workers downtown, and even a few contacts inside the Italian families themselves, gave him a warning. Rather than stopping it, he let the evening play out as expected. Bird sat at his usual table, looking unaware. Upstairs, armed men waited. Outside, others watched the street. An entire performance, held together by people who knew their lives depended on nobody breaking character. When Anastasia's men arrived that Friday night, the doorman let them through without a word. What happened next turned quickly against the visiting crew, leaving several of them dead or badly hurt and forcing the rest to retreat. Johnson's people let 2 of them go, according to the version that's been told and retold, with a note pinned to one man's jacket meant for Anastasia. That detail shows up again and again across different tellings, which doesn't prove it happened, but it suggests what the storytellers wanted remembered. Word of it hit Anastasia hard, or so those who worked under him said. This wasn't some small operator getting lucky. It looked like a total failure of planning, and he went quiet for days. The commission was said to be furious, less at Anastasia and more at what the loss represented. Their whole reputation ran on the idea that nobody crossed them and came out ahead. A second attempt followed, faster this time. It fell apart before it got anywhere near Johnson. Word had already spread through Harlem, and ordinary residents, not just paid men, had started keeping watch for anyone who looked out of place. A third attempt appears in some tellings but is omitted in others. Whether it was 2 attempts or 3, the shape of the story remains the same across all versions. Repeated efforts against Johnson's organization didn't produce what the commission wanted. Each failure cost them credibility as much as manpower. That might surprise you, given how the commission usually handled resistance. In Brooklyn's Lower East Side, smaller operators who pushed back against the families usually folded within days. Harlem wasn't behaving that way at all. There's a term historians sometimes use for this: the grapevine telegraph, an informal system of passing warnings by word of mouth that developed under Jim Crow, when black communities in the South often couldn't trust official channels and needed a fast way to warn each other. That instinct traveled north with the Great Migration, and it shows up in how Harlem is remembered for responding to outsiders during this exact stretch of 1943. The commission didn't switch strategies lightly. Some of the older men argued that backing off would look weak. Costello, who'd authorized the original ultimatum, apparently pushed back. His argument, as it's remembered, was that the commission's real strength had always been its grip on the city's institutions, not just its capacity for violence. Use that instead. So they did. The policy banks that Johnson controlled were regularly raided. Runners got arrested with unusual frequency. Officers who'd once taken his money found it more profitable to work against him instead. His income dropped fast. Some of his own people, worried about arrests, started working with Italian-backed operations instead. Most men would have struck back immediately. Johnson didn't panic. He changed the rules instead. He moved his operations more often. He spread his payments across more contacts, so no single compromised officer could hurt him too badly. None of it fully solved the problem. But it bought time, and time turned out to be exactly what he needed. What ultimately protected him wasn't force at all. It was what he knew. Over the years, Johnson had quietly built a picture of which officers took bribes, which officials had ties to organized crime, and which parts of the system meant to fight corruption were themselves compromised by it. He let it be known, carefully, that if his operation went down, that information would find its way to federal investigators already circling police corruption in the city. The threat wasn't that he'd come after anyone, it was that his downfall would trigger exactly the kind of scrutiny nobody downtown wanted. No surviving record confirms most of this in detail, but the newspapers of the era offer a clue as to why. The city's major papers gave extensive attention to Italian and Jewish organized crime figures. Harlem's numbers operators got comparatively little of that same coverage, a pattern that reflects how black neighborhoods were covered, or ignored, by the mainstream press of that era. The black press covered it more closely, but even those records are thinner than what survives downtown. By early spring, both sides had reached something close to a standstill. Johnson's organization was weakened, not destroyed. The commission had spent resources and men without getting what it wanted. Researchers disagree on exactly what pushed things toward resolution, but one thread of the story involves a police captain who took money from both sides and got careless, letting something slip. That detail eventually reached federal investigators already circling police corruption. Once federal attention turned toward Harlem's policy world, neither side could afford to keep the conflict going. Johnson had become something of a folk figure in the neighborhood by now, and any hint of backing down would have cost him the loyalty that had protected him this whole time. The commission worried that word of Johnson resisting them successfully might give other operators around the city ideas of their own. What eventually ended the conflict, in the version Harlem chose to remember, was a mutual figure trusted by both sides. Someone with deep roots in the old policy world and enough standing to make the conversation possible. That figure is widely believed to have been Stephanie St. Clair herself. No written record directly confirms it, but the idea fits everything else known about her. The exact terms of whatever was worked out were never written down, so far as anyone knows. What does seem clear is that Johnson kept control of the core of his Harlem operation, that direct attempts against him stopped, and that nothing on this scale happened again during his lifetime. Johnson lived until 1968, dying of a heart attack in a Harlem restaurant. Mamie Johnson's memoir, published decades later, described a man who read constantly, who valued education even though prison had interrupted his own education, who tried, in his complicated way, to be a steady presence in a place that didn't always find much stability elsewhere. That's a different picture than the legend of 1943. Both are probably true at once. Anastasia's own end is a matter of record, not memory. In 1957, he was shot while sitting in a barbershop chair on 55th Street in Manhattan, getting a haircut. It made front-page news across the country. Nobody was ever convicted. The Harlem episode, if it happened the way it's told, left no trail at all. His death, 14 years later, was photographed and investigated for years. One life, remembered in two completely different ways. Anastasia's career didn't end with whatever happened in Harlem. He went on to become one of the most powerful bosses in the country, but those who knew him during this stretch suggest it stayed with him differently than most jobs did. A quiet reminder that his method, calculated and patient as it was, had limits he hadn't previously had to think about. Maybe not every detail happened exactly this way. Maybe some of it grew larger each time it was told. But that's how legends work. They survive because they capture something people believe is true, even when not every fact can be proven. And in Harlem, the story people chose to remember was simple. Power could buy fear, but it couldn't buy loyalty.